just after 3 p.m. UK time, so just over an hour. So just to set a bit of background, this event takes place at a very crucial time in history. With climate and weather-related hazards becoming ever more intense and frequent, we're already seeing their impacts on human mobility. Just a few examples: years of drought in East Africa, sea level rises in the Pacific and across the globe have triggered wide-scale displacements. Closer to home, in fact, torrential rains and floods have caused people to leave their homes in places like the UK and Germany, for example. So suffice to say that stepping up climate action could not be more urgent, as highlighted in the latest IPCC report. But this requires states to place those who are already and will be most affected at the very center of their policy action. Climate action must include people on the move. Now, when we're talking about environmental migration, this is referenced in a number of global agreements. Firstly, we have the Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration. We're entering into the 4th year of the Global Compact. It was endorsed back in December 2018. And this recognizes climate change as a driver of migration and the need to strengthen regular pathways. The Paris Agreement also recognizes environmental migration as a result of climate change. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development also recognize environmental migration. Can I just, if it's difficult for people to listen in, can I ask everyone to voluntarily mute themselves, please? If that doesn't work, then I'm going to ask our administrator, Abir, to, she can put everyone onto mute. So Abir, please do that if the background noise doesn't go down. So just going back to what I was saying, so the 2030 Agenda, the SDG goals also talk about the effects of climate change. And in the most recent COP26 discussions, the Glasgow Climate Pact reaffirms the need to protect migrant rights when addressing climate change also. However, despite the increased visibility of the migration climate nexus within global discussions, examples of concrete policies to address environmental migration challenges and to promote safe mobility pathways are unfortunately quite limited. 2022 is going to be an important year to assess global progress on a couple of fronts, on both climate action with COP27 coming up in November, and on migration governance specifically with the Global Compact for Migration. Its 4th year coming up, as I've mentioned. We have the first International Migration Review Forum, the IMRF, which is set to take place in May. This is going to give states an opportunity to demonstrate the progress they've made in migration governance alongside the objectives of the Global Compact. So crucially, these discussions are going to provide a policy space for policymakers to bridge the action that's needed and to address environmental migration, in both their internal and external commitments. Now, the good news is that migration policies which acknowledge environmental drivers already exist. And crucially, there are examples for countries to learn from each other. Some of these pathways, mobility pathways, are acknowledged in the 2 papers that I've already just mentioned, which have been recently released by the Center for Global Development and IOM. These papers take the experiences of various countries, examines what works, and highlight recommendations for how high-income countries such as the UK could facilitate environmental migration, show leadership in upholding their global commitments. So we'll hear more about these now in today's discussion. We'll also hear about how some of these solutions look like in practice. How can high-income countries draw inspiration from these and support these? And finally, we're going to hear from a leader and an activist who has experienced firsthand climate-related displacement and what difference such policies can make on the ground. So I'm hoping that this discussion is an opportunity to reflect about how we can learn from the experiences of various countries in addressing current environmental migration challenges, and how we can rethink migration governance to anticipate future challenges and create opportunities for migrants, countries of origin, climate-affected countries, and countries of destination alike. So now I'm going to hand over to Mariam. Just a quick intro to Mariam. Mariam Traoré Chazouino is a senior policy officer with IOM. She's based in IOM headquarters, and she has expertise in migration, environment, and climate change. She's been working on policy issues related to climate change and migration since 2013, and has authored and edited several articles and publications on this topic. Mariam has been with us since 2008 in different positions across the globe. Mariam, over to you.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think you made a very good job to summarize what I've seen myself over the past years, which is that there's a lot more emphasis on the climate and migration nexus in the global policy discussions. But now we're at the stage where there really is a need for national policy making to make concrete changes. And our hope is that the paper that IOM and the Center for Global Development have developed can be helpful in that regard. So this discussion will be fast and I hope dynamic. Each speaker will have 3 minutes, so I'll probably be strict on the time. They'll each have 2 questions to answer to, and I'll start with Helen. So Helen, she led the development of the 2 papers that we are discussing, and I think the link would be put in the chat box in a minute. She's a policy fellow and an assistant program director for migration, displacement, and humanitarian policy at the Center for Global Development. Please, if you can, read the papers that Helen led, because they are excellent. I read hundreds of papers on the climate and migration nexus in my life, and I think hers are probably among the best. So Helen, first question for you. Can you briefly summarize the main findings of the papers? And maybe in your view, how can high-income countries like the UK could facilitate migration from climate vulnerable countries? Thank you, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mariam, and thank you for co-authoring the papers with me. And it's so lovely to see everybody here on the chat today. So I think Tawhid has already done a good job of outlining why CGD and IOM decided to write these papers. We felt that a lot of times the legal and policy discussions in this space seem to be stuck at an impasse. So anytime climate migration is being discussed, it seems to focus solely on whether these people should be classified as refugees or migrants. And we felt that the false dichotomy was really ignoring the fact that there's an urgent need to act. And it's also ignoring the fact that there are many countries and regions who are already acting, and these are lessons that we should be learning. So one of our papers, for example, looked at how regional free movement protocols, things like the Colombo process in the Bay of Bengal, the Kampala Convention, and the ECOWAS protocol on the free movement of persons and goods in the Sahel, and the Caribbean Community and Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, are already facilitating the movement of people in the face of climate change. And our other paper looked at high-income countries, countries like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and countries across Europe, finding that actually many are already expanding their asylum grounds or experimenting with different forms of visas. But we asked quite a big question in the paper, which is, why should high-income countries care? Why should they facilitate environmental migration? And I'm sure we'll hear today, and you'll see it strongly in the climate and migration literature, that the vast majority of climate migration will be local, national, and regional. There will be very little international climate migration to countries like the UK, at least in the short term. But we actually make a point that there are very good reasons as to why a country like the UK may want to promote climate migration in the UK. So I'm going to quickly outline 4. So firstly, to champion innovative policies in the climate change and migration realms, and sort of amplify their position to other high-income countries. Secondly, to support more climate adaptation in countries of origin and reduce drivers of distress migration by facilitating remittances and skill transfers. Thirdly, to offset the impacts of aging societies and skill shortages. And finally, to uphold their global commitments under the Global Compact for Migration and the other agreements that Tauhid mentioned. So in our paper, we outline a number of different policy options that countries could look at pursuing, and we broadly classify them into easy, medium, and hard, although noting that all of them will be very difficult. So I'll start by outlining the easier recommendations. So the first is to extend temporary protections to people from countries affected by disasters. So this could include things like staying deportations or extending visas and benefits. Now, many countries have already done this, and I think the US and their temporary protected status is the best example, which we'll hear about later from Catherine. But it could apply to people already in the high-income country, or we could look at how to apply it to people who are outside the country when a disaster strikes. Secondly, we could be targeting labour migration pathways to climate vulnerable countries. So many high-income countries are already creating labour migration agreements with low and middle-income countries. These could very easily be targeted to facilitate movement from climate vulnerable countries or areas. Then we had two medium difficulty recommendations. So the first is to create a new ground for asylum claims. So asylum is already granted on a case-by-case basis in most countries. So the ground for the claim could be as limited or as open as the country wanted. And second, to establish a visa lottery for people from climate vulnerable regions or countries. The best example here is New Zealand's Pacific Access category, which lets in a small number of people each year from climate vulnerable islands. And finally, the hard recommendation, to design a new visa for people affected by slow onset disasters. These types of humanitarian visas have been considered by basically all of the countries we looked at, but they are very difficult to implement in practice. And perhaps we can go into why later in the discussion. Finally, we also developed some overarching considerations that countries should keep in mind when exploring any of these options. Things like consulting across government and non-government stakeholders, especially affected people themselves, responding to and expanding the evidence base on the links between climate change and migration, and ensuring that whatever is implemented is objective, easy to understand, and flexible. So as Mariam mentioned, there's plenty of more detail in both reports. I encourage you to read them, and please do get in touch with any questions and comments, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. So let me turn to Alex Randall, who is a program lead on climate change and migration. Alex is a leading expert on this topic. He's written extensively about really complex situations, including the Syria crisis. I'm sure if you Google climate change and migration, his name is probably one of the first to come up, and you should read what is written, because I think he makes an excellent job to make it understandable to any kind of audience. So in fact, that's great, Alex, that you're here, because you can explain to us maybe what are some commonly held beliefs about the climate migration nexus, how does this come together, and what does it mean for high-income countries? Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, and thanks to inviting me to the call. I think there are a few really common misconceptions about the connection between climate change and migration. Things that are pervasive in the way that the media talks about it, that shape our kind of common understanding, that are unfortunately quite misleading. We've touched on a few of them already. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is this idea that climate change is going to create a form of mobility which is going to be across international borders. And I think it's really important for us to ground this conversation in the reality of the dynamic, which is in fact that the vast majority of migration and displacement connected to climate change in the first instance is going to be internal. People are not going to cross international borders. They're going to move within their own country. Very often they're going to move temporarily, hoping to return to their original destination. Very often they're going to move seasonally. People are going to move from rural areas to urban areas and then return. But a huge amount of this mobility is going to be temporary, it's going to be internal, it's going to be the rarer cases where people cross international borders. And I think what that narrative has done, that media narrative or this common misunderstanding, has led us to believe that the nature of climate-linked mobility is going to be kind of apocalyptic, right? There are these stories which conjure up these images, which see, you know, potentially millions of people crossing international borders, and not only is this issue presented inaccurately, it's also presented in a way which is anti-migrant, anti-refugee, it's xenophobic very often. It has these kind of racist overtones where people on the move as a result of climate change are presented as a threat, right? They're presented as a security problem. They're presented inaccurately as a threat to, you know, the safety and the way of life of developed countries. And this is obviously extremely problematic, and it's gone a long way to really kind of disrupt or derail the debate about what the actual policy options are. So I think grounding our discussion in that reality is really, really important. Now, that's not to say that there won't be some cross-border mobility, and that's exactly why Helen's papers are so important, because while it's true that there will be internal mobility, and of course we should be focused on the rights and the welfare of migrants and displacees in those contexts, we do also need to think about the rights and welfare of people who may cross international borders, and that's why this conversation is so important. How am I doing for time?
For time, you have 1 more minute.
I have 1 more minute. Okay, let's see what
it.
I can. Yes, I'll take my final minute. So I think the key question that we need to look at when we're thinking about this in terms of governance, and I want to kind of just zoom out like one step here and say, like, when we're thinking about these policies, when we're thinking about governance, who is it who is doing the governing, and who is it who is being governed, and in whose interests is that governance taking place? And my view is that we need to put migrants, refugees, displaced people right at the center of that equation, right? This governance needs to be taking place with their rights, with their welfare, with their well-being right at its core. And I will stop there.
Perfect. Everyone is so good on time. Thank you so much, Alex. I think you make such a good point, because sometimes when we speak about how can high-income countries facilitate migration, there is a fear that we are talking about facilitating massive migration. But in fact, what we are talking about is having better governance system. It's not necessarily about having more migrants, although this shouldn't be an issue, but it's more about reforming what we already have in order to increase the protection of people. So please, for the attendees, you can drop questions in the chat. And I think also my colleagues will paste a link to a chapter that Alex and I wrote recently that touches a bit upon the future of climate migration in connection to a slow onset event. But now let me turn to Lena Bren. She's a disaster displacement advisor for the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, which is a coalition of countries in East Africa. So Lena has really extensive experience on the topic. I've known her for many years. She's worked before for the Norwegian Refugee Council, and now she's working directly with the countries who belong to the IGAD. So we are very happy to have her here. So in the papers, we touch upon briefly on the IGAD protocol on the free movement of people. So maybe Lena, you can explain to us briefly what is this? How does the protocol address the climate, disaster, migration, displacement nexus, and how do you see the future of these protocols? Do you see opportunities and challenges? And I know it's a long question for 3 minutes, but you can circle back to that later on as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mariam, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And also, please stop me after 3 minutes if I'm still speaking. You can just raise your hand or do anything else, just that I see that I should stop. But I will actually just continue on what Helen and Alex just have said before, because yes, of course, the protocol is here. It's also new. This is also, I think, why it was not extensively drafted in the document that you have that you have done. But I'll just give you a very brief overview of what it is. So the protocol, this is the free movement of persons protocol, which is valid for the IGAD region. And as you have said, IGAD, which this is a regional organization and is tackling the countries in the Horn of Africa. This is a protocol, it was a process of 2 years of consultations with the member states. And then finally it was adopted in 2020. And last year was the final adoption at the IGAD level, at the level of Council of Ministers. So the protocol now is adopted. It is there, but the next step is the ratification and then of course the implementation. And I will come to that a little bit later when we are speaking about the question of challenges and opportunities. But first, what I would like to say is this protocol, I mean, there are a lot of free movement of persons protocol which can be used in the instance of people who are moving in the context of disaster and climate change. But the IGAD protocol is actually the first time that specifically speaks about these kind of movements. So there is one whole paragraph which speaks about people affected by disasters. And it is actually really a great paragraph and a great opportunity, because on the one hand, it is specifically saying that it facilitates the entry and the stay for the people who are moving in anticipation of, during, or in the aftermath of a disaster. So this means that it goes even one step further. It is even saying that it allows the people who are at risk of displacement to move before it actually comes to a disaster. So this is actually quite progressive. And then the third point is that it also specifically says that it does not allow to send the people back as long as the return is not reasonable or possible. So this means the stay will be extended as long as it is not possible to return. And I will also just kind of on one point that Alex has said before is that, yes, we do not expect to see like too much of the international movements in this area, but what we are actually seeing in the Horn of Africa is that we do see a lot of regional movements. So many people they are constantly on the move, and specifically thinking about the pastoralists, for example. I mean, they are moving across the borders, and I mean, we all know how the borders are done. So I mean, there are lots of movements, but they are taking place regionally. We are not expecting the huge international movements, but we do see the movements like on the regional level. So just very quickly on like, these are the opportunities, of course, and I already mentioned the challenge, because I think the protocol as such is great, but we also know that it only becomes like a great opportunity once it is implemented. So now, of course, like our biggest work is to make sure that that we support the member states in the implementation. And I hope I was not too long, but
no, it's exactly on time.
Thank you.
Anyway, you reach exactly the key question, which is not just for the IGAD protocol, but also for all the global discussions and other regional discussions, which is how do we move from words to practice? Because now we're seeing more and more of these guidelines, principles, protocols is one step further, but we do have instruments, but the question is how do you implement them? So let me turn now to Catherine Anderson. She's the Deputy Chief of the Office of Policy and Strategy in the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is under the US Department of Homeland Security. Catherine, Ellen talked a little bit about the temporary protection status, the TPS. So in your experience, can you explain quickly to us what is the TPS? What are the main technical and legal challenges when you try to implement a TPS in the context of climate change? Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be here and talk about this important topic. Let me first talk a little bit about what temporary protected status is in the United States, and then I'll get into your challenges question. So temporary protected status is an immigration status that was enacted by Congress. So it is in our law, and it provides the executive branch the authority to designate a certain country for this protected status. And if a country is designated, then most of the nationals who are in the United States, at the time of the designation, are potentially eligible for this status. So that is one thing I'll get into a little bit more later, but I think it is important to point out that it applies to people who are in the United States at the time that a country is designated. A country can be designated initially for anywhere from 6 to 18 months. So it is, a temporary status, but there's certainly the potential to extend if the country conditions continue to warrant the extension. People who are eligible for temporary protected status receive work authorization, and they're also generally eligible to get travel authorization to return to the country if they need to take a trip abroad during their time of designation. There are 3 statutory bases on which a designation can be based, and so we are restricted in terms of when a designation can be made. So the first statutory basis is an ongoing armed conflict that prevents people from returning in safety. The second is an environmental disaster that prevents a country from being able to handle the return of its nationals. And the third is I wouldn't quite call it a catch-all, but it kind of is. It's extraordinary and temporary conditions that prevent people from returning in safety. So while we do have these very, 3 clear statutory criteria that we have to fit situations into, as you can see, they are, fairly flexible and squishy, which does give us some flexibility in making these designations. In terms of challenges in the climate context, I mean, I've touched on a couple of them. I think the first one being these 3 statutory criteria. I mean, the situation in the country that gives rise to the designation does have to fit into one of those criteria. And I mentioned there's extraordinary and temporary conditions, there are, environmental disaster. So certainly a lot of, I guess I would say, specific situations caused by climate change can give rise to a designation, but we can't make designations specifically on the basis of climate change. That said, certainly in the past, we've made designations on the basis of a severe hurricane. We frequently cite drought or flooding in kind of the extraordinary and temporary conditions category, and armed conflict as well. I mean, of course, we know that conflicts can be caused by climate exacerbated factors. So certainly, I think we have some flexibility there to make designations when situations in a country arise based on climate change, but not explicitly to designate based on climate change. I think. Oh, sorry. Am I at my 3 minutes? I'll stop.
You
finish
get
later.
another minute if you have something to add.
One other thing, and I can get into it a little bit later in our second round of questions. But I do think one of the key challenges is that this is a temporary authorization of stay for people in the country, and so it can be extended, and yet there's no permanent path to citizenship or permanent lawful presence. So people end up in a situation of, being in the United States for quite a long time if the situation in the country doesn't resolve, and yet under our law, not having kind of a pathway to a permanent status in the United States.
Thank
I
you
will
so
stop
much.
there for now. Thank you.
That's absolutely fascinating. There's been so much talk around this temporary protection status, like how can they help people who might need to migrate also in the future. I think if you check out the Nansen agenda, it has a bit of an analysis of what other countries have done as well, but I'm pretty sure that the US is the most advanced on that. So it's really interesting to hear directly from you. And then the last speaker for this round, it's Miss Ursula Rakova. She's a climate activist. She's based in the Carteret Islands in Papua New Guinea. She has done really, really heroic efforts to be here with us tonight, late at night for her. So we really thank her for making this effort to come and join us. Ursula is a very well-known activist. She has been a beacon, a voice for the civil society. Her and her community are amongst the first to have to leave their ancestral land because of climate change. So she will talk a bit about this experience. So Ursula, can you tell us about your experience of climate-related displacement and relocation in the Carteret Island? What's happening and how do you feel about this situation? Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, and good night, everyone. It's midnight here in Papua New Guinea. Anyway, my experiences on the relocation of the Carteret Islanders has not been an easy movement. We started to prior to moving our people to mainland Bougainville, which is 45 kilometers off the northeast, we had to do other things like going around the whole of Bougainville, trying to talk to them and educate them about climate change and the impacts of climate change. We had to do chief exchanges where we could get people to understand why we were moving and why we had to move. We also needed to get land that is safe and secure for our families to move into. It wasn't easy, but we were lucky to have the Catholic Diocese of Bougainville gift us some parcels of land. So our first wave of relocatees moved in 2009. Our second wave of 5 families moved in 2011. So when we moved, we also needed to make sure that we integrated into the community. We made sure that our families were learning new skills of adapting into the new community as well. And what we did on mainland Bougainville, we also tried to do on the Carteret so that our people understood. Our people were able to also attend trauma counseling sessions where they had to do that on the island and also on mainland Bougainville. We also did a lot of advocacy because in 2005, between 2005 2007, the word climate change was first heard about, but our people did not understand. When the king tides were happening, they were sweeping over the islands. Our people said, the spirits were not happy with us. And so those are things that we needed to make sure that people understood, that it wasn't the spirits who were upset with us. It was, the impact of what was happening outside that was causing the rise of the sea and basically displacing our people. Our identity was very much one of the things we had to look at. We had to make sure that we were an island people, but we were moving to safe areas. But we also made sure that because we are an island people, we needed to keep our identity in place. And these are things that people are also beginning to understand. People are beginning to realize why we had to keep that. And so there are other things as well that we do on mainland Bougainville that's beginning to get the families used to physical and manual work. But also on the island, we continue to do adaptive activities like making sure that we are growing, making raised bed gardens so that people on the island can plant a bit of cash food crops where they can harvest later and consume with their fish and marine resources. And also one of the other things we are now trying to do is to reforest our mangrove areas so that we buffer the strong currents from further intrusion into our food gardens, protect our shorelines so that the sea does not continue to wash over, and that we are keeping our ancestors and our ancestral home safe, at least for maybe another 50 years until our children can get used to the idea that we will eventually have to move. One of the most difficult things was getting basically integrating ourselves into the host community, making sure that the host community was accepting us, making sure that we were aligning our culture, our values, and our identity with what was around us. And so today we've done a bit of work where now the host community accepts us, and we also beginning to play our part as a new community into the host community. One of the things we want to do, we want to continue to do is mitigation in our new community, building resilience in our new community. And with building resilience, we're working with also trying to work with other communities in our host community to plant mangroves so that the shorelines on the coast is also safeguarded. With mitigation, we have actually planted a lot of trees in our new area, apart from cash crops, food gardens, food crops, and all that. Our mini food forest, we've planted over 51,000 trees. That is softwood, hardwood, fruit trees, nut trees, and palms. Because we know that eventually in the long run, like maybe in the next 100 years, our grandchildren, our children and grandchildren can benefit from the mini food forest. One of the other things we also want to do is, because we have 3 other areas that the Catholic Church has gifted to us, we want to compulsory purchase those lands so that we hold the title and we can do what we want to do on that land, and that nobody can come in later and tell us to pack up and leave, and then we will find new land. So we want to outright compulsory purchase those lands from the Catholic Church in Bougainville. And we also want to make sure that we continue to travel back and forth to the island, catch our fish, smoke our fish, dry our fish, and return to our new community. And so that in case anything happens, we are safe. We have another home that we can call home, away from the atolls. But it has not been an easy move.
Thank you, Ursula. Indeed, it's not an easy move at all. And maybe just to flag here that this is not just a matter of relocation happening in the Pacific. The other day I was listening to a TV show in France, and they were interviewing people on the coastline of Brittany who also have to consider doing planned relocation because of coastal erosion in France. So it's not just a matter of having to consider planned relocation of people in some contexts. It's a phenomenon that can touch a lot of different countries. I have a proposal for the panelists. Maybe we can skip the second round of questions because I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat. And maybe we can just pick up one question per panelist and just go with that. I hope that's okay with everyone because we only have about 15 minutes left. And for Helen, I'm seeing actually, I saw a question for you, which was about skills transfer and the role of human mobility in reducing carbon transition. So if you don't mind talking about that for a few minutes, then it would be wonderful. And then any other panelists, if there is a question in the chat that you actually really do want to answer, can you please have a look and see if there is anything that you really want to pick up on. So Helen, please.
Thanks, Mariam. There are so many incredible questions in the chat, and I hope that we're doing a good job of answering them as best we can, and happy to be in touch after the panel as well. So coming back to the question about migration and skills, It speaks to another of the comments as well. So often migration in the face of climate change is presented as a threat, as a bad thing, as something we need to stop. And actually, as the commentator points out, there are many opportunities inherent in people moving in the face of climate change that we should be trying to harness. So two of the ones that I mentioned. So firstly is making sure that any remittances or skill transfers or norm transfers that are sent back by migrants, and these could be internal migrants, national, regional, or international migrants, are being used for climate adaptation and improving resilience back home. And there are plenty of examples of this already happening around the world. Seasonal migration is an excellent example of this. And I think we need to be doing more to make sure that we're harnessing those remittances and that they're going towards productive adaptation. The second, which is a bit more nuanced, is around the skills that will be needed to combat climate change globally. We know that there is a large number of things that need to take place to be able to accelerate countries towards the low carbon transition. And those skills are needed everywhere. They're needed in Djibouti, they're needed in the UK, they're needed in Papua New Guinea. And if there are ways in which we can harness migration, whether that's temporary or permanent migration, to be able to increase and enhance these skills globally, we will all be better off. And so there are definitely proposals already on the table to try and explore innovative migration partnerships to enhance skills for the low carbon transition. And I'd be really keen to talk to anybody who's particularly interested in this point.
Wonderful. I think that's one of the key policy issues for the future, actually, because it's also about providing opportunities and having maybe a more positive narrative around climate change and migration. So extremely important. There are many questions, so I'm just picking up one for Alex. But Alex, if you want to do another question, please feel free to jump. But I was thinking maybe you could talk about how do we change the narrative of climate refugee, especially because you're also working in terms of social media and outreach. So I don't know if you have views on that.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that we need to understand about why the narrative has ended up being so problematic and so, you know, leading us to so many of the kind of problematic conclusions that it has. And I think one of the big issues is that the voices and experiences of migrants and refugees and people on the move in general are just not really part of that debate in the media in northern countries, I would say. So if you look at the media coverage in the UK and the US, mainly it is referencing kind of other, you know, northern researchers, security analysts, politicians, who of course should be part of the discussion. You know, as a northern researcher, like you know, I my voice is in the mix as well. But what you see missing is the experiences of people who are on the move, the voices of people who have been displaced, the voices of migrants and refugees. And I think that would bring a kind of reality to the debate, to the discussion. And it would do two things. I think it would show us, firstly, that mostly these forms of mobility are, as we've seen, internal rather than cross-border. But it would also bring a kind of humanity to it as well. It would focus us on the experiences, the welfare, the rights, the well-being of people on the move, and shift the discussion more towards that, more towards what people on the move need, rather than focusing the discussion on the ways in which northern governments might try to prevent or curtail people's mobility. So I think that change in focus is really important.
Thank you so much, Alex. I was wondering, maybe Catherine, if you wanted to add something to this. You don't have to, otherwise we'll ask you another question, but if you wanted to jump in there, maybe it would be interesting to have your views on that.
I don't know if I have anything specific to add to that necessarily. I was actually really kind of looking through the chat and really focusing on a lot of the points that people made related to, you know, it's very difficult to identify one specific nexus for migration. And I think we see that in all contexts, not just related to climate change, but I think I was just really, that was resonating with me, because I think it is important as we consider, what tools do we have as a government and what tools do we want to create as a government to help, climate migrants. I think it is very important that we recognize that the reason for movement isn't always going to be entirely clear. And also to this kind of point of temporary movement that I know Alex has been talking about, I think we do, as a government, think about, okay, people who are coming and they need to move permanently. And I think one thing we need to keep in mind as we're setting policies and programs are, people may just need a place to be temporarily. And so when I think of a shortcoming of our temporary protected status, it certainly has some challenges and some shortcomings, but actually, maybe there is a clear need for temporary protection and really the flexibility of movement, essentially. So I don't know, that was just jumping out to me as really thinking about as we design solutions, not necessarily designing a solution for someone who identifies, or we would identify as, a climate migrant, because the reasons for moving are so complex that I think we really can deal with it through a variety of different pathways, whether it's labor migration pathways, whether it is a refugee pathway, just providing that flexibility, I think will be really important in developing solutions.
Thank you for this comment, because again, that's another of the key issues that we're looking at when we're talking about going from guiding principles towards action. I personally feel that there is a lot of goodwill from different governments to try to address the climate and migration nexus, but the goodwill is not enough, because you also need to understand what you can do exactly. And the problem is, when you have a nexus with so many different components, it's really hard to figure out where you actually start and how do you address all of these dimensions. So I think you made such an excellent point. Thank you so much. So maybe Elena, now, I saw there was a question for you, which was about emerging discussions surrounding people moving before a disaster occur. So what do you think, what kind of mechanism should be in place to enable these movements? I don't know if in the context of the IGAD discussions, this is something that could be taken further. And so if you have any comments on that, it would be great if you could share. Thank you.
Thanks so much for this excellent question. And I think, yes, of course, there is a lot that can be done actually before people are moving. And I think here again, I think we need to disentangle between like people who want to move, because some people would, if they have the options, they would like to move. So of course, there protocols like the Free Movement of Persons protocol, for example, is a great example, because then you can really facilitate these movements so that they don't have to take like the very stressful and the very dangerous ways that they sometimes have to take if it is not facilitated in a regular way. And then, of course, also facilitating like that they are able to work and have access to the livelihoods, etc. So, of course, this is like one side. And then on the other side, what you can do a lot in this regard is like all the work that all the different agencies, all the different governments are doing in the area to prevent displacement to happen, because there is a lot that can be done so that people don't have to move if they don't want to move. And here we are looking into all the different areas of disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness. So we are doing from the IGAD side, like different ways on how we tackle this. So on the one hand, for example, we're looking at the policy side, so that we really want to ensure that whenever we are speaking about disaster risk reduction, we are not forgetting about like the people who are also affected by this. So we are really working very closely with the governments to ensure that both the displaced but also migrants are included in the disaster risk reduction policies. And then on the other hand, we are also working very concretely, like with our, like IGAD has a climate and prediction application center. So this is like a center that is also approved by the WHO, not WHO, MO, sorry. So they are providing the climate predictions and giving the seasonal forecasts. So whenever the season is changing, so 3 times a year, they are coming up with a forecast on how the season will look like. So if there is less rain, if there is more rain, if it will be drier, if it will be hotter, etc. And what we are doing right now is that we are also including the information for the people who are most likely to be displaced about in this kind of forecasts. So we are trying to ensure that, like, when we do have the information on the climate side, that we also link it with the migration and the displacement data, so that we can also identify the people who are most likely to be displaced or most at risk of being displaced. And then, of course, it cannot stop at that end. It needs to really go down to the local level. We need to work very closely with the communities to see, like, which are the ways they want to, or the opportunities they would like to foresee. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Lena. That's perfect, because that's a good bridge to maybe asking Ursula for her input, since you're talking about local communities. That will probably be our last question, because we are running out of time. We are very happy that so many people have asked questions, but I think we'll have to finish with Ursula. So Ursula, do you have any lessons learned from the process of relocation? Is there anything you want to bring to the attention of high-income countries, since this is the topic of this event today, or any other concluding remarks that you might have? Thank you so much. And again, thanks so much for making the effort to be here with us at midnight, your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. Just something short for me. Like for, in terms of policies, I really feel that international policies also need to look at island communities in the Pacific that are actually really going down, and that policies should be user-friendly for them to eventually migrate. We are lucky here in Bougainville because we have a bigger island we can move into. Also that climate financing really needs to reach the most disadvantaged communities that are finding local solutions to their problems on climate migration. And I think that is from me, because it's been some of the struggles that we've had since we've started our work on moving our people to safe and secure homes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. Thank you so much. Well, I think it's extremely fitting to actually close on your voice. I think we have a few more minutes. Yes, we have 5 minutes. So let's maybe ask everybody for a 1 minute closing, like Ursula just did. If there's one point that you want this audience to take home after this discussion, because we've seen that in 1 hour, you only scratch the surface of the surface. So maybe there's one key message per panelist that they want to share. We heard Ursula, so maybe I'll go to Alex. Here you go.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. I think I would say the key thing I'd like everyone to kind of bear in mind or think about is the possibility that migration might actually be a viable and empowering form of climate change adaptation. And we need to stop thinking of climate adaptation as building infrastructure so that people can stay put. And we need to think about it in terms of how it might facilitate people to move if they want to.
Wonderful. Lena?
Yes, now I was unmuting, apologies. Yes, I will just build on that, because on one hand, of course, I completely agree with Alex that we need to change kind of the discussion and the point that migration is something good and we need to see the positive aspects of migration. And then I would just add the other side, that there is a lot on the preparedness side that we can do a lot also to support the community, support the governments, etc., and to ensure that these people who don't want to move, that they don't need to move. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Lena. So, Catherine?
Sure. I think my concluding thought is really just that, you know, sometimes I think we get stuck waiting for new laws or new legislation or something that will create the climate solution relating to migration. And if there's one thing that I think I've really come to realize in my work, it's that we really need to be creative and use our, you know, existing migration pathways that we have in each of our countries to fit this new context. I think, of course, we can certainly encourage a change in the laws, but at the same time, we do have some tools, and I think we really need to be creative in how we think about using them to address this situation that we find ourselves in now.
Thank you. And then finally, Helen.
Yeah, just following up from what Catherine said, I think my takeaway would be to focus on implementation. There are plenty of examples that we've looked at where there were great laws on the books, but they were never actually implemented, or not implemented fully, or not implemented properly, or states didn't look at what the impact of the implementation of their policies was on affected people. So I think, as Catherine said, be creative, be experimental, pilot, test, evaluate, and scale where possible.
Thank you so much. I don't actually have anything to hide. I think you all highlighted one part of this nexus. That's why it's so complicated to go from words into action, because there's just so many points to take into consideration. Before we close, I think we have to extend thanks to a few people. We have to mention that the papers that we discussed, the IOM and Center for Global Development paper. So Helen led the work for one of them, but Amelia Dalpra led the writing for another paper, which is focusing on regional dimensions. So you have the links. I also encourage you to check it. So thank you, Amelia. That was a lot of work, and it's a great paper. And then, of course, IOM London, our colleagues, Martina, she's made a lot of efforts to make this event happen. So we have to extend our thanks to the technical support. Thanks to Madeline Page, who has been following these discussions right from the beginning. So all of us remain available if anyone wants to keep discussing after this event. I think we can only thank everyone. I don't know if Tawhid, you want to maybe just say goodbye to everyone, since you are the head of the London office at the moment.
Thank you very much, Mariam, and you've said all the thank yous. And a final thank you to you as a great moderator, especially when we have so many chats coming in. I think the speakers, all the panelists have handled as many of the questions as they can, both in the chat as well as now. So thank you very much to the audience in particular for showing such a keen interest in this important topic.
Exactly. Thank you, everyone. Have a good end of your day, evening, night, morning, wherever you are. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Miriam.